Hello and welcome to Book 8. This is the book. I feel like I should do a drum roll. This is the book we've all been waiting for. This is the book where all the Augustinian pathos is going to reach a resolution in the famous garden scene. This scene has been treated for so long by so many different people. I'll do my best to try to bring something fresh and inspiring to you. And I'm just honored that we're doing this together. But this is book 8, which we're going to call Conversion, because here is where it all happens. I'm going to begin reading to you from chapter 1. And I want to see if you notice something. In a spirit of thankfulness, let me recall the mercies you lavished on me, O my God. To you, let me confess them. May I be flooded with love for you until my very bones cry out, who is like you, O Lord? I don't know if you noticed, but book 8 begins the way book 1 began. So you could stop the video, go back to book 1, but this is intentional. It's a new start for Augustine, and it's good for us to keep that in mind. Lots of different themes in this book and different ways we could approach it. One thing I want to bring up before I forget, and I'm kind of jumping ahead, I'm going to go back and forth a little bit because there's things to look at thematically, not necessarily chronologically. In chapter 5, Augustine talks about, being weighed down. But did you notice his weighing down is connected to his being asleep? He's asleep and he can't wake up. The Lord is knocking. He's finally going to wake up in the garden. But this is a very common theme in Scripture with St. Paul and with the saints and with a lot of these famous books in our 2,000-year-old history. So he's asleep. God is waking him up. It's very much okay. So just wanted you to be cognizant of this theme of sleep. Now, the theme that I would like to talk about as we look at this is the theme of imitation. We know Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And book 8, while it is about Augustine and his receiving of this grace where he is able to move out of his chains of lust, while the camera is zooming on Augustine, I really want to focus on how it is actually because he's part of a community of people that he is able to do this. In fact, I was just listening to a talk on Augustine from Dr. Peter Kreeft, and he pointed out, he was comparing Augustine to Sartre. And he said, Sartre is the philosopher of the I, but Augustine is the philosopher of the we. And I just love that because we really see that in book 8. And that's what I hope to show you when I talk about imitation. So I am still in chapter 1. And just very simple sentence, but Augustine says, Lord, you inspired in me the idea that I ought to go to Simplicianus. He says that simple sentence. Now I'm skipping. I'm on to chapter 2. He says, accordingly, I made my way to Simplicianus. These two sentences, I want you to stop right here and notice. The way Augustine is writing this book here, is as Augustine makes his way to the garden, it is because of other people. He's making his way and talking to other people. And it's not just Simplicianus, it's a whole network of imitation. So I want to talk to you about that today. So just a little bit of background. In the Christian life, imitation is stamped in. It's in Scripture. It's in the lives of the saints. There's no shortage in our history. For example, you might know, and I might have mentioned it on this podcast, Saint Teresa of Avila was a changed woman when she read Augustine's Confessions. Saint Edith Stein one night read St. Teresa of Avila's story, and she was a changed woman. And St. Edith Stein also, one day she saw a woman praying at the altar silently in church. That changed her life, just seeing something and imitating it. This is very common in the life of the church. So deeply embedded in the Confessions are portraits of relationships of imitation that shape how Augustine is orienting his heart. There are three central figures, namely St. Paul, St. Anthony of the Desert, and of course our friend St. Ambrose. Those are the three central figures, but there are others buried in there, and I don't want us to miss it. Also, it's very important to point out in Christianity, we have imitation. We also have what we could call false imitation. We also have many examples. We could go back to St. Teresa. She had a cousin who was a bad influence in her life. She read some bad books that led her down a dark path. We have false imitation. Augustine, of course, we're thinking of the episode with the pears. He had false friends, false camaraderie, false imitation. That led him down a path of vice and not virtue. So it can work the opposite way. Thinking about imitation, forgive me, I forgot to mention a more modern famous one is St. Ignatius of Loyola. He was not living a good life. When he was recuperating in bed, he happened to come upon the lives of the saints, and that changed his life forever. We wouldn't have the spiritual exercises if he hadn't read those books. So imitation is very important. Okay, so back to Augustine. He has some bad examples. We know, though, of course, he has some good examples. We know he watches Ambrose reading, and I think it's not in the Confession so much, but it's good to talk about Augustine and his other works. He wrote a famous work on the Trinity. We should always keep in mind that for Augustine, his image of the Trinity living in our human souls is very important for imitation, because he helps us to understand that when we are introspective and we're looking inside ourselves, we are in fact looking at an obscure vision of the Trinity inside of us. And Augustine also writes about this in his other classic, The City of God. He says, "We do indeed recognize in ourselves an image of God that is of the Supreme Trinity. We resemble the divine Trinity in that we exist." So Augustine is very much about, I can see God in me, in creation, and in others. Of course, it's a blurred vision, but this is part of being human. And so we have to gaze, we have to look, and if we look at the right things, we can imitate. Also, not just Augustine, but the early church fathers were heavily into studying this life of imitation. St. Ignatius of Antioch, for example, he saw the narrative of the Passion as a template for his own journey. He links the two together. So does St. Polycarp. So just want to show you this is deep and early in our history. And St. Augustine is drawing on that. So, also wanted to mention humility is important, because when we lack humility, we don't think we have anything to learn from other people, or we think, oh, well, I saw a flaw in that person, so certainly I can't learn anything from them. And we think everyone has to be perfect before we learn from them. Augustine, of course, suffered from pride, but we've seen him grow in humility. He's in awe of Ambrose's humility. In fact, it is in this book 8. It's mentioned as a side note about Ambrose and the proliferation of monasteries. And it's very clear that Ambrose doesn't brag about that. He's so humble. This profoundly shapes Augustine's reorientation as a Christian. So humility is essential also. Now, let's look a little deeper. Here is sort of an image of what's happening in the Confessions, and how the layers lead to the central characters. So as I mentioned a moment ago, Augustine has a visit with Simplicianus. He says, this is, quote, a man from whom grace radiated. I hope, therefore, that if I could discuss my perplexities with him, he would bring out from his storehouse appropriate advice as to how a man in my condition might walk in your way, meaning the Lord's way. Okay? So when we're reading that, we're supposed to be like suspenseful and like breathless that, he's going on this visit. Is his agony going to come to an end? So that's why I read to you, as I made my way. We're just held in suspense here. Okay, there's a tension here. Now, it's interesting, when he does finally meet with him, what does Simplicianus do? Well, he ends up talking about somebody else, Victorinus. When Victorinus comes up, if you read, Augustine's passion is growing. He hears the story of onlookers chanting, Victorinus, Victorinus. And Augustine wasn't there himself, but he makes us feel like he was. And he actually, like when I read that, I feel like I am there. And then my heart starts burning because Augustine's heart is burning. He wants ours to burn also. He says, quote, on hearing this story, I was fired to imitate Victorinos. I ached for a like chance myself. This desire is strengthened. Do you remember what happens next? When his African compatriot Ponticianus visits unexpectedly. In a clever use of foreshadowing, Augustine writes how, kind of like in a seemingly random moment, picks up the book lying nearby. It's everything's take and read. And what does he pick up? It's the letters of St. Paul. I hope you caught this. This is beautiful symmetry and artistry here. Augustine is kind of whispering to us, hey, get ready. St. Paul is going to be big here in a few minutes. It is beautiful foreshadowing to let us know that it is going to be those words from Romans that will change Augustine's life forever. And I love this because this is supposed to get you and I excited about Scripture. I just read some words from Deuteronomy that I hope are going to make a real difference in my life. Just the life of Scripture is so exciting. And I love how he does that with such artistry. So he says, quote, but then he smiled, looked up at me, and offered his congratulations, surprised by his sudden discovery that those writings and those alone were under my eye. So once Ponticianus sees that Augustine's studying the Scriptures, well, then he starts to tell a story. Oh my gosh, just such an exciting story. The story of Anthony of Egypt, who... Now we got to get our bearings here. So Anthony of Egypt, of course, is an early desert father, but Saint Athanasius wrote his biography. And let me tell you, when Saint Athanasius wrote this biography in the early church, it was popular. It made a huge impact in the early church. I wish, it would be like the equivalent. Oh gosh, I'm trying to think if something came out today on Twitter and a book that we all had to read and talk about, it made such a big impact in the early church. So everyone's talking about it. Okay. So he tells him the story of Anthony of Egypt. So I don't know if you know the story of Anthony of Egypt. It's famous. He, was looking to follow Christ, wasn't quite sure how to go about it. One day, at Mass, he heard the gospel story where Jesus tells the rich young man, remember, to go and do what? To go and sell everything. When Anthony heard that, he said, that's me. God is speaking to me directly, and he did indeed do that. And there we have a desert father and his whole story and everything that he went through with his life in the desert. But it all came from what? Augustine wouldn't want us to miss this. It came from hearing Scripture. and he heard it as a divine command. And that should be happening to all of us. It may not mean that we are called to sell everything, but there's going to be something in Scripture that will speak directly to our hearts that we will know is our plan of life for every baptized person. So, he will tell him that story. Then he talks about the proliferation of monasteries. And as I mentioned earlier, to Augustine's surprise, he finds out that Ambrose was involved. He's mentioned quickly. And it says Augustine and his friends are spellbound. Pontitianus continues by telling the tale of his companions, here more people, in Trier who went on a walk. Okay, they're on a walk. And as the friends go their separate ways, he later finds out that this other group of men, they're like imperial secret service agents, kind of. They happen to find a cottage full of men, follow me, inspired by the life of Anthony. And then they begin to wonder out loud, well, why can't I do that? Okay, so do you notice there's different groups of men? But this group says, why can't we do that? This man was toiling and giving birth to his new self, and it comes through this transformation by reading. Quote, he directed his eyes back to the page, and as he read, a change began to occur in that hidden place within him where you, meaning God, alone can see. His mind was being stripped of the world as presently became apparent. The flood tide of his heart leapt on, and at last he broke off his reading with a groan as he discerned the right course and determined to take it. By now he belonged to you. Capital Y, you. And he boldly tells his friend, if you have no stomach to imitate me, at least don't stand in my way. Notice this is about imitation. Pontitianus and his original group of friends, they are not unmoved. They're engaged, they have girlfriends, fiancés. They and their betrothed decide to forego marriage and dedicate themselves to God alone. So all this, I don't know if you noticed, it has a violent effect on Augustine. He now, it's just amazing. This is the moment he can face his sin. He can face it right now. He stops hiding. He didn't want to hide before, but he just did not have that grace to change. In contrast to the men in these stories, he is loathsome to himself. Now Augustine's heart is ready to hear an invitation from the Lord himself to propel him forward, okay? And we know it's going to happen in the garden. I just wanted to kind of show you how we've been laying the groundwork. I've been showing you in this book, but I want you to think about all the books leading up to this, how the groundwork has been laid primarily with Ambrose and the reading of Scripture, okay? It's very important to remember that. Now, when it finally happens in the garden, I want us to keep in mind it is a response to what? Is it thunder? No. It's the response to a voice. It's the voice of children. And I don't know. I just think that there's something there for us all to learn, a pattern. We call this, of course, this Tolle Legge moment because the children are saying, take and read, and he indeed picks up Paul and he's able to respond to the Scripture that tells him to not give in to the desires of the flesh. But I think it's really important to stop and think about hearing the voice, because throughout our lives, we do hear voices. I don't mean, hearing voices. I mean hearing voices, speaking to other people, going to lectures. Well, for us, listening to podcasts, right? Or television. What voices are we hearing? What are we listening to? I always thought it was so interesting. I heard a Russian professor once say, if you really look at Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, we love Tolstoy, right? When she makes that horrible decision to take her own life, it is because she hears I think it is children, but she hears someone, and this professor called it her Tolle Legge moment. But obviously it was a dark Tolle Legge. So I like thinking about that in the great books. What are we hearing? What are people listening to? And Augustine is finally able to listen, and he can pick up and read. But I also don't want us to forget, we've talked before, Augustine knew how to embrace silence. So it's only when we have silence that we can listen and that the grace can happen. And that is what happens in this garden scene. Let's kind of look a little bit more at that. There was a few things I thought were interesting about the garden scene, which I'm sure you realize this was agony for Augustine. He kept wondering when it would finally happen. I am in chapter 11. I wanted you to see in chapter 11 and in chapter 12, he's crying. I just didn't want us to forget. He says there's a heavy rain of tears, a storm. This is a theme I've talked about in other podcasts of nonverbal communication. Remember, we talked about that previously. Augustine doesn't want us to ever forget that tears are just presented to the Lord and we don't have to say anything, and that the Lord responds to that. So that's just, I wanted to return to that theme. Another thing is the journey of Aeneas. I had mentioned to you before, Augustine presents this as a journey of Aeneas and the founding of Rome and his wandering. Back in chapter 8, he talks about this is a journey not undertaken by ship or carriage or on foot. He's referring to Aeneas and to the prodigal son. So Aeneas wandering, I wanted you to see that connection as well. Also, I didn't want you, it can be easy sometimes in this book to think that Augustine thinks he has two wills. He doesn't. He's just talking about the battle within his will. So he wasn't a heretic and he didn't believe he had two wills, but he is talking about wrestling within himself. And his language is so dramatic. I think sometimes there can be a little bit of confusion. So I just wanted to talk about that. Also, I didn't know if you caught this. This is fascinating. When he does embrace chastity, did you notice how it's presented to him? This is in chapter 11. It says he sees the chaste, dignified figure of continence. It's like he says like he kind of has like this voice, a feminine voice, telling him sort of like, come on over to the life of chastity. When we hear about lady continence, to me, I like to think about, I don't know if you've read Boethius, which he'll be a few hundred years after Augustine. That book is about lady philosophy. And then I can't help but think about St. Francis of Assisi, and he talks about lady poverty. So I really thought this is interesting, kind of thinking of, a trinity of images: lady continence, lady philosophy, and lady poverty. Three beautiful feminized images for what we need in the Christian life. Just wanted to draw your attention to how he does that. Now, this garden scene where he finally has the ability to move out of lust into grace is, I don't want to belabor the point, but I guess I will. Notice the word, meaning scripture, the word has the power to bring things to pass. That is the beauty of the two-edged sword. And also, did you notice, who does he tell right away? Monica, the role of Monica. He tells her right away. And I also think it's interesting, Augustine had made fun of people who read Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, kind of like in a way that almost invites superstition, because kind of like they would have like a way to randomly pick out a passage and use that sort of like fortune telling. And Augustine makes fun of that, but yet he just sort of opens the Bible and there's St. Paul. I think it's important to talk about that. I think what Augustine is telling us is that sometimes in the mystical life, there are moments where a random opening of a book can change our life. That can happen, and it did affect him, but I do want to make it clear, he is not advocating this as a general guide for life. He isn't saying every day we just randomly open scripture and do what it says. He isn't saying that. He is saying this happened in a dramatic moment in his life, and I think it's probably pretty common for people to have this type of a moment, but he isn't advocating for us to live our lives that way. I just thought it would be important to make that clear. Well, I think that there's a lot to ponder here. We have the conversion of all of these people. It happens in a garden, and now Augustine is set free, and his suffering in that particular realm is coming to a close. And then we're going to see how the rest of his story continues when we go on to book 9. And I guess all I could say is Tolle Legge. See you next time.